Hi, it's Carol from Bookreporter.com, and I want to welcome you to our latest Book Reporter Talks to interview, where I'm going to be speaking with Marjan Kamali, the author of The Stationery Shop, which is one of my favorite books of 2019. And I am so excited to have you here today because we've been emailing back and forth for a couple of months now, but it's nice to be able to sit there and really be able to chat about a book that I enjoy so much. It's one of my bets on selections, and I'm also going to read what our reviewer said. The Stationery Shop is a heartfelt and gently written novel, yet Kamali is unafraid to tackle big and difficult themes. The gorgeous jacket art will catch the eye of potential readers, but once the spine is cracked, they'll find a wonderful story inside. So I think that really sums up the way I feel about the book.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carol, and thank you for having me here. I'm very excited to be here, too.
I know.
Be with you in person.
I know, because we've been chatting, and as soon as I read the book, I immediately wrote you a note. But it's like, wait, I need to know more about this book. So let's start out with you telling our listeners about The Stationery Shop.
Well, The Stationery Shop is a love story. It's about a pair of teenagers who meet when they're 17 in 1953 in Tehran, and they fall briskly, as F. Scott Fitzgerald says.
Briskly, I love that.
Into an intimacy from which they never recover. I love that quote, and it's the epigraph, one of the epigraphs to the book. And they have this whirlwind romance. They're courting at a time when the country's blossoming with cafes and a cinema culture and publishing and theater. And they're set to get married, but on the eve of their marriage, they're separated. For reasons I won't get into, no spoilers. And then they reunite 60 years later in Massachusetts.
Right. I understand that there was something that inspired you to write this story. So tell us about that, because I found that fascinating.
Yes. So the whole kernel for the story happened because I was doing book events for my first book, Together Tea, and I was visiting a lot of book clubs. And at the end of one of the book clubs, a woman came up to me and she said, I work at an assisted living center. Would you come and visit and just read for the residents? I said, sure. So a few weeks later, I drove down to Duxbury, Massachusetts, and I was doing a reading, and this elderly man in a wheelchair kept saying things as I was reading, and I didn't know if he was heckling me or if he was cheering me on.
Heckled at the nursing home.
Heckled at the nursing home, yeah. Wouldn't be the first time. So after the reading, they had organized this lovely Persian lunch, because I have a lot of food.
Right, lots
of
both
books,
right.
Yeah. And we were sitting down to lunch, and this elderly man came up, and he kept saying things like, I met the Prince of Spain, I traveled with Charles de Gaulle, and people around him were kind of shushing him and just slightly embarrassed by the things he was saying and dismissing him. And I kind of wanted to talk to him, but finally I just asked him his name, and I was surprised because it was a Persian name. And then a few weeks later, I went home for Thanksgiving, and my dad asked me, how's the book, how are your events? And I said, fine, and I told him about this gentleman. I said, oh, and he had an Iranian name. And my dad thinks he knows every Iranian American.
Okay.
So I told him the name, and he said, oh, that was one of our most decorated dignitaries. He met the Prince of Spain, he traveled with Charles de Gaulle, and he proceeded to tell me about this gentleman's life. And I was just stunned, because I thought, wow, what does it take to have this past and to be sitting in this center where no one believes you?
Yes.
Or worse, they believe you and they just don't care.
Right, and they don't, yes, and nobody's asking you any questions about it, nobody's conversing with you about it, yet it was your life.
It was your life. And so I just took that kernel, that image of an elderly man in a wheelchair, and that became the image that started The Stationery Shop. The opening scene is in a nursing home. And again, I don't know too much about that actual man's real life. Maybe his friends in the center did know and did care, but it was just that contrast of what was happening at that lunch. And I started to write with that one scene in mind, but then because of who I am, it became a passionate love story.
Oh, I love it. I love it. We automatically then know that these characters are going to get together at the end of the book. What made you decide that had to happen right up front? The story didn't feed contiguously, and so there's no surprise really that they are going to get together. What made you decide to write in that order?
it was so important to me to frame the story that way. You know, people had said, well, if it's about them meeting when they're 17 and falling in love, why don't you start when they meet, when they're 17 and fall in love? But for me, the frame of the story had to be when they were 77, because the entire drive of this story is the fact that they weren't together. So for me, it's not just a love story, it's also a lost love story.
I like that.
And I wanted the reader to know that they spent 60 years not together, and that after 60 years they got together. And, you know, in the editing process, there are many things writers change, but there was one thing I was supremely wedded to, and that was that opening scene.
That the opening would be exactly the way it was, because it's very powerful, because you just are saying, well, wait, we still don't know what happened.
Yes.
And you don't know why it happened, but you know that they're sitting in the same place.
Yes.
And I think it was a very different way to start out a book. And we'll get into, because there are twists that happen in this book also along the way.
Just a few.
Yeah, just a few. The relationship between Roya and Baman, is that do I have the correct pronunciation, is at the core of the story, and they meet at Mr. Fakhri's stationery shop. So tell us a little bit about stationery shops,
Oh
because
my gosh.
we're like, a stationery shop, do you just buy stationery? But it seemed like they were real social havens for people to meet at.
Yeah. I mean, I love stationery shops to this day, and a lot of independent bookstores now, as you know, have a stationery section,
Right.
which I love. But this stationery shop was inspired by a stationery shop my dad told me about. And he told me there was this stationery shop in Tehran when he was growing up. And the stationery shops back then didn't just sell stationery, they sold books. So they were kind of like independent bookstores. And he just told me about how it was this hub, and high school kids after school would go there and kind of hang out. And so the more I heard about the stationery shop, the more intrigued I became. And then I started to write about a fictional stationery shop where I could make whatever I want.
You could do whatever you like, which is a lot easier than focusing on something iconic that you'd have to sit there and figure out what to do. Was writing their earlier story easier than writing the latter day story, or vice versa?
You know what? It was vice versa.
Right.
I'll tell the truth. I wanted more of them when they were 77. And I was really into them when they were 77. But the feedback I received was, you know what? We love them when they're old, but we want a lot of young romantic love.
Right.
And so I had to go back and add a lot of the scenes in Tehran, which, again, I didn't even think people would be necessarily interested in, but it turns out people are hungry for that.
Yeah.
So I found the younger scenes harder.
Well, if they're very young, they're 17 when they first meet. And I was trying to figure out how precocious you actually could be in a culture where things were really so closed in a lot of ways. But by the same token, they have to be a little bit precocious in order to be meeting the way they are or whatever. So there was this balance going on of, are they typical 17-year-olds, or are they ones that are living a little bit more out on the edge? Am I wrong in what I'm feeling that way?
No. I mean, the culture was closed and open at the same time, because it all depended, and to a degree still depends, in Iran on class. So their class, the middle class, the upper middle class per se, would have had more freedoms than somebody in, you know, a rural village from sort of a quote-unquote lower class. So, but they were still on the edge. They were pushing the edge, because all of that was new. It was part of this kind of opening up of the country that was happening, which is kind of ironic, because in a way it was more open for the young then than it is now.
And it is now. Yeah, that is now what's going on. You know, and did you find that the teens were very mature at that time? Because I feel like right now, a 17-year-old, they're kind of goofy compared to the way these children are portrayed in this book. But I think they were living in a very different time, a more sophisticated time in a lot of ways.
I think you're absolutely right. In a way, they were more mature. And I think that's global. Like probably U.S. teens were also at that time a little bit more mature because they were closer to the end of their lives, technically, than they are today.
They're marrying younger.
Yes, marrying younger and having more responsibilities younger. I think a lot of it has to do with lifespan. You know, when you think of the lifespan in 1953, it was different than today. And so I think 17, 18-year-olds felt and acted older, per se. And they weren't babied as much as we baby our own teens today.
Yes,
you know.
The helicopter mom. There were no helicopter moms back
they
in
were
the 50s
independent, much faster, much younger.
Yeah, but they expected you still to be towing the line.
Yes.
And still there was a lot of family culture that was imbued into everything that you had to do.
Yes.
And there were certain responsibilities that you had, and then there were freedoms.
Correct, yeah, there's a lot of social mores in Persian culture, and that transcends time. To this day there's a certain way you have to talk to elders, there's a certain way you would treat a guest, there's a certain way you behave and dress in public that you wouldn't, you know, let's say in the US, things are more casual here. There's still this kind of sort of old worldiness to some of the interactions, and that's changing, and things are getting more casual, but there's definitely more formality in a lot of relationships.
I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, there's times where I spent 17 years at Condé Nast before I started this company, which is now 23 years ago, but it was really funny because there are times where I'm sitting on a street corner in the morning, and I'm driving in, and I'm looking, and I'm like, no one is dressed what I would consider appropriately to go to work when I first started working. The way people just throw things together or not, and wear these things, and we've gone in a completely different direction, and I'm not sure that I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, and you know, that's why it was so fun to write about 1953, because people did dress up, and there was a sort of glamorous culture in the city. So in Tehran, I guess sophistication, glamour compared to today, people weren't wearing sneakers, you know.
No.
They took great care in their appearance.
Well, it was like when women used to leave the house, even in the States, it was like dressed to go to the food store. You dressed to do, now everybody dresses to go most places.
Yes.
And it's interesting because you're in a really lovely restaurant, and there are a lot of people that are not dressed like they're in a lovely restaurant. And it's, I don't know, call me old-fashioned on that, but I just find it, kind of interesting. You worked hard to create realistic characters from a part of the world that Americans don't know really well. And did you always see them the way we see them now on the page, or was there a lot of editing that went into those characters to give them that kind of feeling that they're so rich for us right now to be reading?
Thank you for saying that. Initially, of course, in the first draft, I didn't know them as well myself, but I got to get to know them. And Roya, we hear most of the story from Roya, the young woman's point of view, who then becomes an older woman. She was someone I could get to really quickly. I felt like I had her. I felt like I knew her. I had never before written from the point of view of a man, believe it or not. So it was harder to do the Batman scenes, to have his voice. But I ended up having his voice told through letters. So it's in first person, and there's this intimacy that you can get with letters. And so I got to know him so much better as the drafts
as he was writing these letters, and everything was very interesting. I never thought about that the first person was carrying the story that much, because you were just hearing him telling his story as opposed to you describing him.
Yeah, so for him, that was my way of getting closer to him.
Interesting. Now, Roya's got a sister named Zari, and you were able to accomplish a lot because the sisters were able to have a conversation. So the internal dialogue that you would be originally hearing, you're actually hearing them being able to have conversations. And because they're close in age, she's able to confide in her the way she wouldn't be able to confide to a teacher or mother or things like that. So was that very intentional that she had to have a sister, or there was somebody her own age?
Yeah, Zari is sort of like a foil to Roya, because Roya, our heroine, is sort of very by the book. She follows the rules for the most part. When we first meet her, she is not exactly a rebel, and her sister, who's younger by just 18 months, is sort of a foil. She's naughty, she's mischievous, she likes to push all the boundaries, But she functions as a kind of Greek chorus in Roya's head.
I love it. Yeah.
As the years go by, she's so used to talking to her sister, so used to kind of processing everything with her, that even in scenes where Zari isn't present, Roya can hear her sister's voice in her head, and the reader can see, oh, here's what Zari would think of that. And I liked having Zari's voice in there as a kind of counterpoint to everything that Roya might be thinking.
Right, and she's also kind of questioning the whole time of, what am I doing? Am I doing the right thing? Why am I doing this? But you're hearing her sister's voice saying, oh, well, is this going to happen?
Yeah, her sister's no nonsense.
Right.
Yeah.
Just pushing her away. So books and writing infuse so much of your storytelling. Is that what we'd see a lot in the culture in Iran? Is there a lot during that time period?
Well, yeah. I mean, it started with poetry. So Iranians to this day, like if anything happens, there's a poem for it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I grew up with, let's say you woke up and you had a bad morning. My dad would recite a stanza from Rumi or Hafez or Sadi that kind of applied to that situation. And it's mostly because in school, children are taught these ancient poems and they memorize them.
Wow.
So it becomes kind of part of you. And so poetry is huge. Literature is huge. There's just a gravitational pull, I think, in the culture because it's a very artistic culture.
And it's very colorful culture at the same time as well. And the
Yes.
words are colorful as well.
Yes, and the language is, and the
the
idioms.
cover of the book.
Yeah,
Where
I
it
love the
was
cover. I
different.
love it.
Was this a cover all along, or were there many iterations?
You know what? Initially, we had a different cover, and it was a lot blander. And when that cover was making the rounds, I think people within the publishing house said, you know what? This doesn't match the tone of this book, and it doesn't match the depth of this book. And everybody went back to the drawing board. And for a while, I didn't know what the cover was going to be. Then when I saw this, I was blown away. And I've gotten so many comments about the cover.
The cover is just stunning, and it just pops, and it really, I think, has the whole style of the rest of the book. Is exactly what you're saying. Like, you can judge the book by its cover here.
I know. In this case, I am happy for people to do so.
Yeah.
They just went all out, and I'm just so grateful.
And I think that many times people don't know that what really goes into coming up with the cover is the people at the imprint are actually reading the book, and they're trying to come up with what the style is going to be, what the look is going to be, how the author's name is going to appear, how the words are going to appear on the cover, what needs to be bigger, what needs to be smaller. And I think that one of the things that makes the cover design so interesting is the person's usually been that involved with the book. They've read it, and they've seen what this is going to call to me from the shelf. Does it look at?
Yeah, I mean, it really, in my opinion, reflects the tone of the book, and you're right, even the font was very carefully chosen to kind of reflect a bit of a different time, bit of a different place. Calligraphy is mentioned in the book, and so they were very careful.
Just have that look. The look, and the look says something when you sit there and close it. You're like, oh, this is a package. And we often talk about books it's not just the writing, it's the packaging, it's the way the whole package is put together. And this one, I think they completely nailed and got it completely right.
Yeah,
so
awesome.
I know a little bit about Iran in the 70s, just a little bit, as well as over the last couple of decades, but I don't really know anything about the 50s. So what was your research process like for going and researching the 50s?
Well, I was like you. I knew the 70s, and I obviously knew and everything after that. But my research process was, I did read. I read, non-fiction accounts of 1953 and the coup in particular. But I also bugged every elderly relative I knew, and to the point that they got sick of me. And I just kept asking questions, and the more questions I asked, the more I realized people don't want to talk about it. And, eventually people opened up and shared with me anecdotes about their school days or what happened that particular day for them. And the person who was the most forthcoming was my dad. And he really, he talk to me about the city of his adolescence and his high school days and what they were eating in the cafes and what they were listening to and the tango dances, which took me by surprise, and so much took me by surprise. And so I got a feel for the texture of that time. I was lucky because I had access to them.
It was a much more vivid and colorful culture than what I was thinking about. I think of it being very, very drab, and with bits of color. But when you're writing, I definitely got a completely different vibe, and it was a very alive city. It was, and you think of it now, and I think of everyone being conspiratorial and afraid. And I did not get the feeling that that time, even though there was a lot going on, it was quite the same way.
There were a lot of political divisions at that time, and the country was polarized into three main factions. It was the people who were pro-Shah, pro the Prime Minister, and pro-communist. But you're right that with Iran, even today, people think of it as drab, and nothing could be further from the truth. And in fact, my daughter said to me once, you know, when she went to visit as a kid, she said, I thought it would be in black and white, but it's actually in color.
Very
and it's a very colorful country with a lot of contradictions and a lot going on, like parties and demonstrations, and it's rich. It's a rich culture.
Is there still a sort of caste kind of a system there of there are people who are very, very wealthy and people very poor, and that there are different layers in the society? And I confess that I don't know that much, but is that what we're still seeing?
There is less of it. The lines have been muddied to a degree, but there is definitely a class system. And class dictates a lot.
Dictates status, dictates jobs,
dictates future, you know, especially, less so probably now, but in 1953, class meant a lot. And I think we underestimate what class does. Even in this country today, you know, we like to think that we are beyond class, but class can dictate your fate.
A lot of different things. Yeah. And I think that it's not just where you go to school, it's not just who you associate with, it's where you're going to have to pull yourself up from to get ahead. A couple of weeks ago, Jean Kwok was here, and we were talking about, she was talking about, you know, she came over, she moved here from China, her family was working in a sweatshop, and she had to find her way out of there. And I think it's not quite the same of what happened, but it is definitely, there are these cultural associations that people have to work to overcome.
Exactly.
So, you know, from there. You write a lot about August 19th, 1953, and you actually write about it very much in depth. So let's tell our readers what happened that day and really why you felt you had to get those details right.
It was a big day. It was a big day for the city. It was a big day for the country. It remains a big day for the world, because what happened that day is there was a coup d'etat that overthrew the prime minister. And because the prime minister was overthrown, the Shah then solidified his power. And the events of that day, many would argue, led to the 1979 revolution in Iran 25 years later, which leads to kind of a lot of what's going on in the region today. It was an interesting day because by all accounts that I heard, people woke up and in the morning the country was one way, and by mid-afternoon it was a different way.
Wow.
The coup happened in a matter of hours. It happened in midday. A lot of people were literally taking a nap. They woke up and the world was different. They woke up and the world was different. And there had been an attempted coup 3 days prior, which was not successful on, I guess it was August 15th, I think. But then on August 19th, it was successful, and with the help of the US and with the help of the UK. And so that created a lot of the situation and the divisions that we have today, and resentments.
And it was sort of like a cluster that went like this. It escalated very, very quickly.
It escalated very, very quickly. And I don't even think the people who partook in the coup realized the ripple effects that it would have. You know, at that time, everybody was worried about communism. And Iran had it had a relatively strong communist movement, and
everybody was worried about that, and then something else completely happened.
And in the U.S., we didn't want Iran to become communist.
So did you feel a responsibility to get to the Iranian part of the story right? Like to get the facts right and to get the story out there the best way, because people don't know about this time frame, and it's whatever you're presenting is what they know. And they'll go do more research afterwards. People have been telling me they're doing that, but it's your part of the story. I felt like you wanted to get it right.
Yeah, it is hard because sometimes it can feel like a huge responsibility, because I'm aware that for many of my readers, this is the only thing they'll read about Iran. So I want to get it right. I want to get it right because I don't want to portray Iran with a huge broad brush, which is how I feel it's often portrayed. But at the same time, you know, I'm not a historian or a scholar. My main focus is the story and what's driving the characters. So it's a balance. I definitely did my research, and I was fact-checked pretty thoroughly by Simon & Schuster, but I feel like, you know, the events that were occurring politically and historically are the backdrop to this great love story. But yes, whenever I'm writing about Iran, there is this, it's, you know, it feels like a big responsibility.
A big responsibility what to do.
Yeah.
Well, when did your family come to the States? And what surprised you most when you came here that did make it into the book?
Well, my family came when I was almost 11. We came, my mother, my father, my sister, and I. It was the middle of the winter, so I started 5th grade in the middle of the school year.
Oh, how nice.
Yes.
Middle school in the middle of the year.
Yes.
Really lovely, lovely.
Yes. Though at that time it was still elementary school.
Okay.
But it was still jarring. But honestly, what surprised me the most, and people find this so strange, but what surprised me the most was how similar the kids in my school were to the kids in my school in Iran. Because
Really?
the trappings were different, right? I mean, obviously, maybe the way people dressed, especially because that was post-revolutionary Iran in its strictest time. The outside costumes and some of the mores were different, but the kids were the same. It was the same, you know, bully on the playground, the same queen bee, the same best friends betraying each other. All the dynamics were similar.
They're around the world, wherever, being in 5th grade, anywhere in the world, you drop into the same kind of culture.
It's pretty much the same. Yeah, the human dynamics are similar. And as for what made it into the book, a lot of the stuff that was sort of my experience is in my first book, Together Tea.
Oh, okay.
So in the Stationery Shop, there's less of the sort of semi-autobiographical stuff.
Well, tell us a little bit about the other book, just so that the readers have a background on that as well. Together Tea. Together
Tea, like most first novels, is semi-autobiographical. I had a lot to get out of my system. I'm glad I did. But it's a mother-daughter story. It's about a mother who's so obsessed with math that she makes spreadsheets in Excel to find her daughter the perfect husband.
Oh.
My mother did not do that. That part is not autobiographical.
Sounds kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Excel spreadsheets.
Actually, it's beginning to sound good to me for my own daughter. But it is an immigration story. It's about a family who immigrates to the U.S. after the 1979 revolution and after the beginning of the war. The Iran-Iraq War of the 80s, and they come to the U.S. and the young girl has to adjust to 5th grade. That part is true. And then she grows up in the United States, and it's kind of the tensions of growing up as a newly sort of assimilated family, which in those days you did assimilate, or you were highly encouraged to, which is something that's different. I think.
You were trying to be part of the culture here, fall right into the culture. Don't be different.
Correct.
Especially since that was such a very politically charged time.
Very charged, especially to be Iranian.
Yeah,
very
I remember
charged.
sitting on gas lines, like to get gas at the gas station, and those are like people say, like, what do you remember? And it's like I just remember things in the Middle East and sitting on line to get gas, and the odd and even plates, and you couldn't do this, that, the other thing. And that's what I remember from those times.
Yeah.
Yes. People switching license plates on the back of their cars so that they could go get gas.
Oh,
like
my
all these little
gosh.
things. It was honestly, those are the little behind the scenes kinds of things. So what do you remember of your family's time in Iran? Do you remember a lot?
Oh, yeah, I definitely do. I mean, I didn't grow up there the whole time because I lived all over the world in my childhood, and that's different than the character in Together Tea, because she grows up and then comes here when she's almost 11. But I remember very specifically the war. That's what I remember, you know, and I am a child of war. And I think that when you're a child of war, it affects a lot of what you do later in life.
Do you think that it makes you stronger, or it makes you more brave about trying different things, or does it make you more timid?
I think it makes you stronger. In my case, I hope it's made me stronger. It also makes you feel as though you have to do a million things, you know, because you feel there's this thing called survivor's guilt, where you're the one who got away. So why did you get away from the war, you know, from death, basically? From
conflict and death.
Yes.
You were not part of that.
Yes.
And what happened as a result? And you feel like you owe as a result?
Yes, you feel like you owe, and you feel like, you know, like I feel like I'm not just doing everything I'm doing for me, I'm doing it for all the girls I left behind.
Very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. So have you been back to Iran?
I did go back, much like the character in Together Tea. I left when I was almost 11, and then I went back for the first time when I was 25. And that was the first time I went back. And then since then I've been back, I guess 3 times or maybe 2 times, so for a total of 3.
So when you go back, do you feel, where's the country these days? Do you feel like it's backward? Do you feel like it's what you were envisioning before, or what's happened?
It's a constant sort of struggle there, because there's a push-pull. It's kind of like our red states and blue states, where you have conservatives who definitely want the country to be more conservative, more religious, and then you have, you know, the more liberals who are progressive, and they want it to be back to being secular, which is what it used to be. And there's this constant push-pull. I haven't been back since 2011, so I can't speak to it today. But every time I did go back, it was completely different.
You know, and it's so interesting because we always think about what's happening in politics here in this country. But I think that people every once in a while have to take a longer view of what's going on around the world. Because there's so many countries that are in moments of upheaval politically right now, with different factions, different people, and we just seem to think that it's this country, and it's really not. And it's almost be interesting to sit and have a conversation with people from different places. I remember right after 9/11, HarperCollins put together a group, and there was an imam, a rabbi, and a minister, and they all talked about the meaning of Abraham in all of the religions.
Yes.
And it was this unifying moment right after 9/11 where people were sitting down and seeing the commonalities that people had instead of the differences. And I think that a lot of times we're always thinking like, this country, this, and we don't really realize how many other places the same kinds of things are going on.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And there's echoes of it in all, you know, the other countries. I can speak for Iran that so much of the political sort of polarization is similar to here, where you have conservatives, and then you have now you could argue that the spectrum it's on a different place in the spectrum.
Sure.
It's slightly more extreme than here. That being said, when the revolution of '79 happened, nobody thought Iran would be the country to go that far conservative.
Right.
So I now believe anything can happen anywhere.
And I think that that's because of your view of where else did you live in the world? Besides
I lived in Kenya. I lived in Kenya as a child, so it was sometime after they had become independent from the British, but there was a huge sort of British influence still. I lived in Germany, I lived in Hamburg, and I was born in Turkey.
oh, wow.
Yeah.
You really have lived all over the world.
Yeah, and even as an adult, I lived in different countries. So I'm done with.
You're done. You're
I'm
here?
just tired of moving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Children are happy about that as
Oh,
well.
yeah.
They're moving in 5th grade. you know?
Exactly.
It's like-
I didn't want to do that to them. Yeah.
It's like really, really tough. Your book has a lot of twists that I did not see coming.
Yay! I'm
But
glad you
they
didn't.
completely delighted me. And there was so much there, and I'm not going to spoil anything, but did you always know that you wanted to have these twists as part of the story? or did they happen as you were writing?
You know what, Carol? One of my goals in life was to write a book with twists.
Oh wow!
That
Okay.
was like such.
You succeeded.
Thank you, thank you. It was like such a desire because obviously I grew up reading a lot, like I think most writers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I love when there's something in a book that makes me go, oh my God, like I love that
see that
feeling.
coming, right.
Exactly.
Right.
And I really wanted to know how to do that, and I for a while kind of struggled with it. And Together Tea isn't the kind of book with plot twists, it's more a coming of age story.
Mm-hmm.
But with the second book, I really wanted to do it. So I worked so hard. So I'm so thrilled when people say I didn't see it coming.
Right.
Because
No,
that
it
was
didn't at
my
all.
entire goal.
No. And there's so much backstory that works so seamlessly in the book, but by the same token, you realize later where everything's driving. And I just thought that was, I can't give anything away. It's just, you know.
Thank you, thank you. That was an artistic kind of challenge I set
Artistic
for
goal.
myself.
It was a goal.
Yes.
So when you write, are you thinking in English or in Farsi?
Interesting. So the scenes where they're in the U.S., I'm thinking in English.
Mm-hmm.
And when they are in Iran and they're talking, the dialogue, I hear it in Farsi.
Okay.
Not necessarily the exposition, because that part's in English even in my head, but a lot of the dialogue is in Farsi in my mind.
And you're just here. I remember a couple of years ago, I was interviewing Isabel Allende, and she was saying everything is always in Spanish. It's always in Spanish first. And it made me start thinking about if an author is foreign, like which tongue do you hear things in? Where are you coming from first?
Yeah,
and then
you
translating.
hear both.
You
Yeah,
hear both
I mean,
languages.
English is my second language, but you know, especially with idioms and expressions, I can hear it in Farsi, and you know.
And then play from there, and play from there on where to go. So I take it that your parents have read the book.
Yes.
Yes. And did Dad think that you got the parts right that he was sharing with you?
Yes, he did. He did. I got his seal of approval, which is huge, and my mom loved it too, which is also huge, because you know I think I myself consider myself an American parent, and we praise our children a lot. Like the culture tells us to praise our children a lot, and my parents are from a generation where they don't just throw praise out.
Right.
Unless it's a really good reason. So when I get the praise, it means a lot.
It means a lot because they felt that you really got the story right and that you wrote something to be proud of. That must be a really nice feeling.
It is a nice feeling, yeah.
Especially since Dad was like giving you details all along the way.
Yeah, he gave me details, and I'll be honest with you, a lot of the time I would call him up and I would ask him a question about 1953, and I kind of didn't even need to know the answer, but it became an excuse to hear his voice. It became an excuse to talk to him and to get closer to him, which I will always cherish because this book allowed me to kind of get to that place with my dad, which, you know, it's harder sometimes with people of another generation who aren't used to constantly talking about
their wives and their days and stuff like that.
Yeah.
My dad still has a friendship with the guys he grew up with in Newark, New Jersey on Clifton Avenue. They still have lunch on Wednesdays.
Oh.
And there are fewer of them,
love that.
but they still get together and they reminisce those days. And I just find that to be a really nice experience that people are able to go back and do that.
Yeah.
And for your parents for having moved here,
Yeah.
they gave up a lot of that opportunity to have those kind of memories. So to share those stories with you becomes a much bigger deal. To be able to pass along, like, you know, what mattered to them. And I think that that's what I'm seeing in the book where the older people as well is, I need to know what happened that day, why you weren't there. I need to know what happened and where were you? And it's kind of this unresolved kind of thing. And I think that on many levels, people have unresolved things going on in their later years.
Oh, they sure do. Unfinished business. And you have that was a driving sort of theme of this book, because you have unresolved things going on with yourself, and a lot of times we have unfinished business with people in our lives that we knew when we were younger, and that was also a huge theme of this book. Roy and Bahman, they never had closure. They never had, you know, this kind of neat understanding as to what happened, what went wrong. So for 60 years it kind of haunts them.
And for his mother, she did not want that to happen. So she was, this is not going to happen. This is not what I'm looking for. So in some ways, he goes through his whole life thinking Mom won. And it's like, well, what really did happen?
Exactly.
What really did happen? How did that unfold? Yeah. What do you want readers to take away from the book? Is there one theme or feeling you want them to take away?
You know, I think for me, the biggest takeaway from the book is that time isn't linear. We tend to think of time as linear. We're taught it is. But in this book, Roya is oftentimes 77 and 17. Like she feels 17 when she's 77, when she's back with him or thinking about 1953. And this idea that, and this is a bit of a cliche, I know that Faulkner quote, the past is not past, it's not even past. But the past is not past, you know what I'm saying? And at every stage, we are everything we were. Do you know what I'm saying?
Oh, interesting.
So like today I'm sitting here, but I'm also the older, maybe woman I will hopefully one day become, and the child I used to be. It just depends. And somebody once said it's like those Russian nesting dolls where, you know, all the versions of you.
Versions of you as you go up.
But I think even that makes it too neat because it puts you in order, and it's not even in order. I don't think time is linear. I think we're in different times at once, and we're also in different places at once, because the characters in this book are oftentimes in Iran and America at the same time.
And their feelings, that they're thinking those memories. Also, I think she had a very tolerant husband.
Yes,
to sit there and say, I am perfectly okay for you to go find this man that you obviously loved all those years ago and allow her to have that kind of closure on what happened. And I found that he became a very interesting character in the background, because if he didn't say, yes, let's go do this,
she wouldn't have done it. Absolutely. Walter is Roya's wonderful husband, and of course he has his complications too, but for the most part I wanted to show love. Again, you're not even in love with one person necessarily only at one time. Like you can love two people equally, and Walter loves her so much that he wants to give her the gift of having this closure. That's how much he loves her. He won't, stop her from having that. And I think that's a gift that you can give.
I also think he felt confident enough in their relationship that he would be able to do that. And I think that a lot of people wouldn't feel that kind of comfortable, but he realized for everything they've been through, I'll give you this moment.
Correct.
You'll be back. It's not going to be like you're not going to stay there.
Exactly.
You're not going to stay in that nursing home.
And a lot of that comes with age, and experience and history, that Roya and Walter, her actual husband, have this history together that no one can take away from them.
And though this other history was way back when, so much of her life has changed in the middle. That it is that history will always be special, it will always be this, but she's changed that nesting doll theory along the way of who she is.
Yes.
Was writing The Stationery Shop easier after writing Together Tea? Like knowing they could have a beginning, middle, and end of a book?
Well, again, someone said writing a novel is like climbing a mountain, and I think it's true. So if you've done it before, is it easier to do it again? Yes, because you did it once before.
And there's a top.
And there's a top, exactly. That's huge. Yeah. And you kind of know the ins and outs a bit more. At the same time, you still have to go up a mountain. Still a big deal. It was easier in that I kind of knew how to do plot, which was something I truly cut my teeth on the first time around. It was easier in that I had more confidence because I was like, wait, I did this once before.
Right.
But at the same time, there is no cheating. There's no shortcut. You still have to get to know each character intimately. You have to do all your research. You have to learn the story, figure things out. It's really like a puzzle. and you have to put the pieces together.
And I'm sure there are days that there's no pieces that are fitting together.
Oh yeah, and there's days where you just think, why did I not use my MBA? Which I have.
Why don't I go back to those spreadsheets? They sound so great today.
Yes.
Yeah. But do you think that the linear learning that you learned by doing an MBA helped you with plotting and helped you because did any of that carry over?
You know what? The thing that getting the MBA helped me with the most was to have a tough skin. Okay. I'll be honest with you. Because the people I was with, I was in New York City in the early 2000s where nothing could go wrong. My little cluster in business school, there were 50 men, 10 women. They were sharks. I mean, they were tough. I love them, but they were nobody's fool. And I think I learned from my MBA classmates basically how to have a really thick skin.
Yeah, because people are going to come at you.
Yeah.
And you're just going to have to either stand your ground or be able to sit there and say, okay, I give you that one. I'll give you that one for change.
Fair. Yep. Exactly.
And I think that a lot of times, even in the editing process, even in your personal editing or working with your editor, it's sitting there and saying, well, maybe this will improve it, and do I need to stand on ground on this?
Yeah.
Like, is this the thing? Where's my line in the sand? Where's the line in the sand, and do I have to go where I won't go across?
Yes.
And then there are other times things people bring to the table can improve something if you're willing to listen.
Absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely.
Some of our best ideas are going to come from our readers.
Yeah.
They'll just write you on a Friday night, and I was like, why did I never think of that in
Yeah.
all these years? And it's that outside perspective that people can bring. And the thick skin, you can hear the perspective. Either that or you wouldn't be able to.
Exactly. Like, you
You're shying
can't
away.
be too scared to put yourself out there to even get the criticism, right? Because if you're so thin-skinned, you're not even going to become exposed enough to get the criticism.
Right.
And that's, I think, what stops a lot of people from finishing their books, because I teach writing now, and I have students who are very talented. They have everything for the story, but I think deep down, they're scared of putting themselves out there. You're putting yourself out there for public consumption.
If you're saying you're done, it means that you are saying that this is the best I've done, and then people are going to pick it apart. And people are going to sit there and say, did you do this? Did you do that? I think so what are you working on now? Are you working on another book?
Yes, so the third book. So, sometimes when you're working on the book and the puzzle pieces don't fit and you just want to rip your hair out and it's just like, oh, I hate this. So why didn't I use the MBA, But that being said, there is nothing worse than not writing. So I feel ready to get back into that ocean with the third book and to come up with new plot twists, because that's my current obsession.
Did you plot, with the plot twist, did you do everything ahead of time? Did you
No.
plot it out ahead, or you just knew you wanted to have plot twists?
Yes, it was more that, which is crazy.
Which is really hard.
Which is really hard. I wish I was a plotter who
Right.
plots in advance and then writes to it. But there's plotters and pantsers, and I'm a pantser, so I write by the seat of my pants. So a lot of the plot twists were fun because I didn't know them either. And then as they happened, I was like, so I got that
was
moment.
good.
Yeah.
But then did you have to go back and rewrite to get the reader to that moment?
Then I had to figure it all out. And then I had to, a lot of this happened in ensuing drafts, so then I went back. But what's fascinating is when you go back and you try to make it fit the story, there were so many clues in that first draft. It was like my subconscious was pointing it.
All your little red herrings were being dropped there, and you didn't even realize it.
Yes, and I want to say something to you, because I know you've read the book, but I can't because of spoilers. But in that coup d'etat scene where something big happens, when I went back to sort of make it all fit, I was like, oh my God, my subconscious was telling me to do this all along.
All along.
Even in the first draft,
Wow.
Yeah, it's really fascinating.
Well, there is a great twist, and it is really, and you'll just sit there and going, I did not see that coming. And it makes it a lot of fun. But you know what? The book has been so great up to that point that I feel like that was like the bonus round. I feel like I won like the bonus round in doing that. So
Good.
I look forward to reading what you do next. And I'm
Thank you.
so delighted that we finally got a chance to
I
sit down and
know.
talk.
Me too.
And everyone, really a fabulous book. A great book for book clubs.
Yes.
And if you want to sit there and have a great conversation about something you might not know that much about, I'm thinking like with The Kite Runner, where I did not know that much about Afghanistan, and then I started digging in deeper. That's exactly the way I think you'd feel if you had this conversation. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for
and
having me.
I look forward to the next book.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you with our next Book Reporter Talks To interview. Thanks.